On January 19th, 1911, the day after his historic flight to and from the United States cruiser Pennsylvania, becoming the first person to land and take off from a ship, Eugene Ely agreed to this interview. Now, the voice that you're going to hear is, of course, not Eugene Ely, but these were his comments and his answers to questions at the time the interview was taken in a San Francisco newspaper office. Eugene asked the first question.
How did the landing look from uptown?
I'll tell you what, let's take the elevator up to the roof, and up there you can see the Pennsylvania. She's still in the San Francisco Bay. And from up there, well, you can imagine your flight for yourself. Let's go.
It's no use. If I went up to the dome without my biplane, I'd probably fly down 17 stories to the street. I may as well acknowledge that never in my life have I been able to look down from the top of even a 3-story building without going wobbly-kneed from dizziness, and having to hold on for fear I should fling myself down to my death. I've tried to master this childish impulse, but I wouldn't go up there for $100.
It's less than 250 feet up there. You've flown 10 times that amount, many, many times. I don't quite understand.
True, but you are confusing biplanes and rooftops. The kind of support you have while up in the air has a great deal. It has everything to do with your sensations.
So I think I see. Having that canvas wing below you kind of hides the ground and reassures you while you're flying. Is that right?
Not really. In an aeroplane in the air, you are in a boat afloat. In a Curtiss machine, the aviator's seat is in front of, and wholly clear of the lower wing. I see absolutely nothing except 2 bamboo sticks, the little front elevation wing, and the wheel between my hands. In front of me and on either side I look down on air. Only the sound of the crackling motor and propeller reminds me that there is anything at my back.
Your machine looks so flimsy. I just don't understand how you're able to fly it.
I turn the wheel to swing the rudder, shove the wheel forward to tip the elevation planes in the front so I will descend, or pull it toward me if I wish to go up. When I tip too much, I lean in the opposite direction against the yoke under my arms that controls the balancing planes and, thus, regain my equilibrium.
That seems so complicated. How do you even remember how to do all of that?
These movements become strangely instinctive and are performed without any mental analysis. The grand thought in my head is that I fly.
I was wondering, now that you've demonstrated that landing on and rising from the deck of a warship are practicable, can be done, would you be willing to take that machine out to sea, perhaps in times of war, and as a regular part of the ship's equipment, perhaps lead an attack on an enemy ship?
Never. Unless my country couldn't find another aviator. Of course, if it were necessary I would go to sea. I believe the use of aeroplanes from fighting ships to be a certain development within the near future. The Navy officers with whom I have discussed the matter believe the shipboard aeroplane will be sent up for scouting purposes only, and not for dropping bombs.
So, you'd be afraid to fly from the deck for scouting purposes, even in the middle of the ocean?
Not at all. But I'd be afraid I might fly over the rail before we got out to mid-ocean. Seasickness, that's all I'd fear. I am a wretched sailor.
And that doesn't affect you when you fly at all?
It is strange. I have sailed through the air for miles in an uncertain wind, every yard of the way rocked as a ship is never rocked. I have never experienced the slightest nausea or even a suggestion of seasickness.
Tell me, Gene, are you ever afraid in the air?
Yes. Afraid that I may not be giving as good a performance as I would like, but never afraid in the sense that you mean. The reason is simple. I never fly except when I know it is safe.
So how do you decide when it's safe to fly?
Well, I don't leave anything to hunches. From inside of me there must come the unwavering assurance that I am fit. I can't analyze this inward assurance in words, but I understand its force perfectly. If it tells me not to fly, then Eugene Ely does not fly.
Are you ever afraid of death in the air?
Death seldom comes in the air. It is almost always on the ground. I believe I am not afraid of death, but I cannot think without a shudder of those endless seconds when dropping through the air from the clouds to the ground. Those are the seconds I never want to know.
Have you ever had a close call?
Many. Once I came down so swiftly that the machine fairly jerked away from me. When I landed, I was sitting on top of the iron yoke that belongs under my arms. Never since have I flown without a rope attached to the framework and tied around me. At times, I've put a stiff pressure against the rope, but stayed in my seat.
I do want to ask you about your flight, but, well, first, I'd like to know what your most lasting memory is about what you've just done.
The cheers that sounded behind me as I sped away from the Pennsylvania were the sweetest music my ears have ever heard. I never regarded the undertaking as hazardous as the naval officers did, but those cheers persuaded me that I had accomplished something real, at last. It seemed, somehow, to wipe out the years-long sting of failure.
Failure? What do you mean by failure? The cheers wiped out the sting of failure?
I mean, until I took up aviation as a profession, my whole business life had been a succession of failures. I became a chauffeur only after the money I started with was gone, and everything I had ever tried left me worse off than before. It is just a little remarkable that of all the famous aviators who were here in San Francisco this week, there is not one who has not told me that before he took to the air, he was a failure at everything.
Now surely these men were just exaggerating, Gene.
James Radley failed in the automobile business in England, as did Hubert Latham in France. Walter Brookins could never keep his bicycle shop profitable. Charles Willard is glad he is no longer a mechanical engineer, and Philip Parmalee failed at telegraphy and many other things. A succession of failures put us all up in the air, and there we found success.
So tell me about the flight. Were you afraid that you might fail?
I feel particularly proud. There never was a doubt in my mind that I would not have a successful landing. However, I want to say, Mrs. Ely is a very brave little woman. If she had any doubts about my success, she was very careful to conceal them.
Were you nervous yesterday morning when you started out?
I felt sure of success when I arrived on the field. I did not regard the attempt as particularly dangerous and therefore did not feel any nervousness.
How did you prepare for all of that?
After going carefully over the machine, feeling every wire, and inspecting every nut and bolt, I felt that it was ready. I put on a heavy leather coat, a leather helmet with deep padding in it, and slipped a pair of wind goggles over my eyes. Around my shoulders I put an inflated inner tube of a bicycle tire, so if I fell in the water, it would sustain me until I was picked up.
Did you have any trouble on the flight, and even that landing on the Pennsylvania?
I warmed my engine and I gave the word to go. I was spinning along at about 60 miles an hour. With the wind behind me, and dropping down to 400 feet, I pointed my machine at the Pennsylvania. As I reached the landing platform, I cut the engine. The only thing that prevented me from landing right at the start of the platform was a puff of wind under me that gave me an unexpected lift. For a moment I thought it was all over. Well, it was over. I had landed on a warship. When the Navy men and the visitors on the ship began to shout and cheer, and all ship's sirens in the bay and in the city began to scream, I was mightily affected.
Now I think your wife was waiting for you on the ship. Isn't that true?
Yes. The rush of the crowd at first confused me, but one of the first to fix my attention was my wife, who had been watching on the bridge of the cruiser. How she got to me so quickly I cannot tell. I was almighty glad to see her.
A true hero's welcome, and very well deserved for you.
It was easy enough to fly over there, but it is no easy job to act the hero. I am no hero, and I guess I made a mess of the performance.
You and your wife had, I think, about an hour lunch with the captain there while the men were out there preparing your airplane for the return trip. How did that takeoff go?
Mrs. Ely had attached a bouquet of violets she was wearing to the Curtiss machine. They stayed on all the way back. The machine warmed up perfectly in 2 minutes and I was off. She swept down the runway beautifully. As I dropped over the stern of the ship, she dipped briefly, but then flew lightly, like a gull.
You told me that you had a little bit of trouble on the return trip. What was that all about?
Going back, I took a different course. Instead of going around the San Bruno Hills, I flew high over them, probably 1,500 feet up. In a moment, I was wobbling and battling for all I was worth in a strong whirl of air currents. For 3 minutes I experienced the roughest flying I have ever known. But I fought my way through and made a safe landing.
Well, you certainly received a joyous reception after you landed, didn't you?
I should not care to enjoy again the sort of reception that those soldiers gave me. I was alarmed by the way they came at me. Half a dozen men called loudly after me and I turned and said I'd be back in a minute. That didn't sit well. A squad of them quickly surrounded me and raised me up on their shoulders and took me to their commander where I had lunch with him. I thought when I left the Pennsylvania I was through with the hero business, but the soldiers didn't see it that way.
But to most of us, Gene, you are a hero.
When all is said and done, the chief credit is not due to me so much as to Glenn Curtis and to the conscientious mechanics who looked after all the little details. No matter how the people may view what I have done, I want it to be known that I undertook the task, not for material gain, but for the advancement of the science of aeronautics.
9 months later, October 19th, 1911, 2 days before his 25th birthday, Eugene Ely died while flying in Macon, Georgia, at the Georgia State Fair. In the year and a half before he crashed into the earth and died, Iowa-born Eugene Ely had already flown his Curtiss biplane hundreds of times in towns and major cities across the United States. By then, he was world famous, the first person to fly onto and off of a ship, and yet, now, over a century later, he's nearly forgotten. He's buried in the family cemetery down the hill and less than a half-mile from where he was born. Thanks for watching. There's more to come, so don't forget to subscribe and give us a thumbs up, too. Have a great day and an even better tomorrow. Thanks.